So welcome to all of you to the third session of the CIUHCT conference series. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Sandra Swart of Stellenbosch University. Professor Sandra Swart is a professor of history and chairperson at Stellenbosch University. She has a DPhil in modern history from Oxford University, and she also has an MSc in environmental change and management, also from Oxford. She has published widely on socio-environmental history and animals in history. She co-authored with Greg Bankoff Breeds of Empire and with Lance van Sittur Canis Africanis, A Dog History of Southern Africa. And she's also written on the Anthropocene and culture and animals in culture and nature. So we're very, very excited to have you here. It's a pleasure. And we're looking forward to hearing you talk about the South African dog.
Well, thank you so much. This is really, it's an honor and a privilege to be invited. And I just want to tell you that this is a chapter in a book called The Lion's Historian. And I have to tell you that my publisher wants it very, very soon. Every time we talk, she says, so it's basically done, Sandra. And I go, yeah. So if you have any feedback, do not spare me. All of you, it is extremely, extremely welcome. And so let me share my slides and then we'll start. And I'll start off with this really beautiful slide. All right. So can you all see it? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Anna, yes. And I have to say, I will be using your slide for quite some time. I think it is, you really have an eye. Thank you. So, all right. We'll be talking about Apartheid's hounds, inventing the South African police dog. And I want to begin by saying that this talk, this project that I've been thinking about for a long time should literally come with a trigger warning. It's a talk with teeth. It will hurt. I can't pull any punches in telling this because that is the nature of history that matters. But do prepare yourself. I want to say that when apartheid ended, something evil lingered. Our country, indeed the world, celebrated the newly free and democratic South Africa, but history refused to relinquish its hold, keeping its teeth sunk into the present. The end of white minority rule in 1994 could not simply miraculously evaporate a racist, violent past. So as I will show you, the infamous South African police, having long buttressed the segregationist state, having long propped up the apartheid regime, contained that which was not only brutal, but as I will show you, brutish. And I'll start like this. In the high summer of 1998, 6 white police officers of the East Rand Dog Unit arrested 3 undocumented immigrants. They were Mozambicans who were just looking for work in South Africa. At first, the police tried to solicit a 300 Rand bribe for their release, but since they had no money, the police officers thought of a different use for them. These men would be bait. What had happened was this: 2 dogs of the 2 younger police officers in the group were disappointingly gentle. Rinty, the one dog was called Rinty, had been donated to the unit as a pet, and he had no idea how to bite a human. The dog unit men had tried to teach him to be aggressive by beating him, but he had just hidden behind his new handler in abject terror. The other young dog, Jerry Lee, was also not much of a biter. She just tentatively grasped with her front nibblers, tearing clothes but never flesh. This just would not do. So they decided to bring in Rex, a bellicose beast, to teach these raw recruits how to be proper South African police dogs. Rex loved to bite. He was an old dog now, but he knew what was expected of him. He knew how to hurt. During the trial that followed this incident, the police kept saying it was just a routine exercise intended to train their dogs to bite on command. It was explained that immigrants without papers made good targets, because they could never complain officially. The method they used, they called tasting blood. Instead of the usual police issue protective suit, they would just use the exposed flesh of the Mozambicans. They drove their captives to an old mine dump, and Rinty's handler started shouting, "Bite him, bite him, bite him." But Rinty just stood there wagging his tail in bewilderment. So they released Rex, and Rex knew exactly what to do. The video the men took of themselves, and now this is stills from the video the men took of themselves, is shocking. The snarling savagery of the police dogs, the excited encouragement of the policemen, the screams of the three victims are a terrible testimony to the failures of the post-apartheid state. This training session lasted almost an hour, and it went on so long because the three men were attacked one by one, waiting and witnessing the brutalizing of their friends, knowing it would soon happen to them. The German shepherds attacked the face and groin of the victims as they screamed. Another went for the throat. But perhaps the most shocking sound amid the cries for mercy, growls, the barked insults and the orders, is the laughter. The policemen were chuckling. And apparently this video was regularly shown at the police braai every year, the police barbecue every year. It was a fellow officer who exposed this, and a video clip was then televised nationally and of course internationally. The South African Human Rights Commission called it emblematic of a deeply psychopathic boys' club of the old South African police. And this was taken up by the anti-apartheid artist Willie Bester the very next year in an art exhibition that he put together. And I'll show you how it looked. I mean, what he's doing here is depicting this incident in sculpture. The articulation of his police dogs' bolted joints, the heavy weight of their bones, their weaponized bodies, the sharp perfection of their teeth suggests the brute, literally the brute power of the state. And it was referencing more than just this Mozambique abuse incident, because there were bad dogs loose in South Africa. Other things were going on. Dogs were disobeying their handlers, dogs were savaging suspects, dogs had to be kept in cages, never allowed to go free. And in fact, when this case broke the headlines, a canine expert from Switzerland came to South Africa, and he said that police dog training in South Africa was rotten to the core. He said the dogs were psychologically sick. They couldn't be rehabilitated. They were trained on fear. They were trained on a racist program predicated on the fear of dogs, mainly by Africans, by Black Africans. He said that the South African police needed a new breed of human dog handler, and certainly a new generation of puppies. He said that these dogs should just be killed, and we should start fresh with a generation of dogs that had never experienced apartheid. Now, this is symptomatic. This story, this exhibition, this anecdote, this vignette is symptomatic of a much bigger picture of ambivalence, of anxiety, of division and fishness and distrust between white and Black in South Africa, between elite and citizen, and between police and people. And it all pivots on this fulcrum of the dog. Let me give you another example. In 2012, 10 years or so after this incident, our then president, Jacob Zuma, you see there, in dispensing his annual Christmas gifts and wisdom, warned his people that loving a dog was merely mimicking white people. He said it showed one suffered from a lack of African values, especially if you walked your dog or took them to a vet when they were sick. Well, to his astonishment, the internet exploded. Social media, Twitter, Facebook was inundated with photos posted by African men of themselves with their pet dogs. And again, we were shown the Trump card, a picture of Nelson Mandela with his Rhodesian Ridgeback. President Zuma was very surprised. His spin doctors went into damage control mode. They explained he was just trying to decolonize the African mind. But what is really going on here? What is this really all about? There is this deep ambivalence about dogs in South Africa. We need to understand why. We need to do it by exploring the history. There is a strangeness in the relationship between dogs and humans, and between humans and humans over dogs. So what I'll do now this evening is explain the strangeness by using the history of the South African police dog as a lens into understanding. Police dogs were creatures poised between citizenry and state, between technology and sentience, between agency and training, and as I'll show you, between good and evil, and always between nose and teeth. I want to just ask the fundamental question: how did dogs become such icons, such signifiers of anxiety and stereotypes that whites and blacks have of each other, and such anxiety, especially the terror of the police dog? And of course, to understand this, we need to go back 100 years. We need to go back to the start of the South African police force in 1911. Just the year after South Africa became independent of Britain, it had to amalgamate the different arms of policing. And one of the very first steps that it took was a great experiment. They decided to use dogs in detection work. And this was a very, very new thing. It had been experimented with in Ghent, and the Germans were looking into it, but it was foreign to the British at this stage. I mean, they tried with a few bloodhounds during the Jack the Ripper scare in the late 19th century. It all gone terribly wrong. So no one was doing it really in the British ambit of influence. But it started out in South Africa as early as 1911 for a very particular reason. And the important thing to remember is that these dogs couldn't have been more different than the stereotype of the South African police dog that we have now. This is a photo of one of them. So the idea was, at the opening of this brand new police station, this dog program in 1912, they started off with just 13 dogs. It was really 5 dogs and 8 puppies that they'd managed to get hold of. They set up this training facility in Irene, Pretoria, in the woods of the Premier's farm. And the idea was to train the dogs at this central base and then send them all around the country to be held in the countryside at rural bases, because their main focus was going to be tracking stock theft. The big concern was stock theft, and they needed dogs to track people. So the dog master was a man called Cornelius Kuiper, and I'm very interested in his individual role in driving this. Sometimes things are not as structural as we historians think. Sometimes they're driven by a powerful individual. And the dog master, Cornelius Kuiper, was this expat. He had emigrated from Holland, and he was obsessed. He was passionate. He wasn't a young man. He was in his 50s, but he was driven. He was absolutely driven. He wrote in official police reports with a kind of verve and poetry and passion. He would write in a police report to the minister, he would write, "My heart beats faster when I read of the successes of this dog." He would ask for good noses from Holland to be sent to South Africa, and he was persuasive. The state bought into it. So he got 2 dogs sent at a vast cost from Holland. And in the first 2 years, these dogs were sent out about once every 2 weeks, and they were very successful in their tracking. They did track down about half the number of cases they found the suspect, normally with the animals or with a carcass of the animal. But the judges did not know what to do with them. They got convictions in only 6 of the cases. The judges didn't know what to do with evidence from a dog. So Cornelius Kuiper made it official. He started a very intense, year-long intensive training program. And you see here what the dogs were doing. Each puppy started at about 4 months old, and they'd be taught retrieval, obedience, obstacle courses, jumping through windows, jumping over things. But the main thing they were taught was track. They were taught to track only human scent, not other animals. And they were certainly not used for anything like attack or defense or patrol duties. Just their noses were trained for. They were just trained to track. And as you see here, they were then driven around the countryside in these fabulous vehicles that they had custom built with a motor car. I mean, I want this for my own dogs. It would be fantastic to drive around Stellenbosch like this. There are these motorbikes with these sidecars, with these police dogs sitting in them. And they were then trained after all of this in the identification parade. And this was one of the most important parts of their jobs. And this was what changed the judges' opinions. So they didn't just track the suspect in the veld, in the countryside. They tracked them with an identification parade. Just like a human witness would line up the witnesses, so too did the dogs. And then they smelt and tracked them down. And now I want you to listen a little bit carefully to how the identification parade worked, because it's going to be important in just a moment. The dog was trained to run from one end to the other of the identification parade. And only on the return trip, he would smell, and then pick out his man, pick out the culprit by standing on his hind legs and putting his 4 paws, his 2 front paws on the culprit's shoulders and barking until called off by the dog handler. So that was the system. It seemed to work. White farmers were, and it was the commercial farmers, because of the iniquities of the segregationist racist state, the commercial farmers were usually white at this stage. And they were first a little bit skeptical. How can a dog sniff a suspect? But they were blown away with the results. And they started begging the government, give us more, we need more tracker dogs, we need more tracker dogs. They worked for the farmers' unions. They wrote letters to the government. They needed more tracker dogs. And these dogs were used for stock theft cases. But they started to be used for other things. Store breaking up on the mines in the Joburg, the Reef area, and in Kimberley. They were used for store breaking. They were used to track arson cases. They were used to track people who have tampered with the railways. Then they were used for murder cases. They were used for a murder case very early on in my hometown, the town I live in now, Stellenbosch. And they were used for rape cases and even cases where an infant had been abandoned, and they were used to track down the mother who had abandoned that infant. It seemed to be working, and the minister loved it. He started pouring money into the program. And so the first year, they had these few dogs, but 10 years into the program, they had 65 tracker dogs, and then it took off, because they started breeding their own dogs at a place called Poort, which they set up in 1923. And in breeding their own dogs, the newly minted South African government got involved in the sex life of dogs. My publisher has asked me not to subheading call this doggy style. She said that's really inappropriate in an academic text. But the ministers get involved in the sex life of dogs on this very top state level. The Secretary for Justice was told that the police bitch Bosco, and Bosco becomes this amazing tracker dog. She was expecting her first litter of puppies. And by the way, all the dogs were kept intact. They were not neutered, they were not castrated, because they wanted to keep the breeding program going. The dog master judged by her bulging pregnant tummy that she was going to have a huge litter, and she was a maiden dog. So he had to get ministerial approval to get by a foster mom, an Airedale mom, to co-raise this litter with Bosco. The state was taking this very seriously. And what was interesting was that Kuiper started experimenting with dog breeds straight away. His experiments in Germany and Ghent, they were using the shepherd breeds. He wasn't into that. He didn't want to do that. And he didn't really think too much of bloodhounds either. His experiments were conducted to determine the best breed for nose, just for scenting, for tracking. He tried Dobermans, Rottweilers, German Shepherds, Setters, Pointers, and even the indigenous Rhodesian Ridgeback. Finally, he's decided on the winning recipe. It was a large pinch of Doberman Pinscher with a dash of Rottweiler. And the Rottweiler blood, he thought, settled the Doberman and made them easier for the South African policemen to use. He wrote there in the notes that he thought that Dobermans without their adulterated blood were a little too clever for the average South African to use. So I've now gone through hundreds of these cases because each and every case had to be written up. It's an archival goldmine. And I found there was a surprising thing, the percentage of confession. People would, if they were tracked by a dog, unlike any other case when they were caught by a policeman, if they were tracked by a dog, they would confess. It's a very small percentage that said that no, they were not the one. Usually they confessed. And I think there could be three reasons for this. The first one is the impact of the forensic science. Dogs could track suspects. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. They could track suspects from 200 yards to 100 miles. There's one dog I'll tell you about who holds the Guinness Book of World Records to this day, 100 miles. And the trails could be 8 hours old because it took long for people to get there on their little motorbikes with the sidecars, or the track could be stone cold. It could be 30 hours old. The dog could still find a suspect. Certainly there was a strong sense of excitement that bursts out of these police reports. You know, there's a sense of wonder. Perhaps the alleged perpetrators, it just seemed pointless to deny this new science. Certainly the commissioner of police, a guy called Truter, believed that Africans, and you see in these police reports how he elides, he kind of always refers to criminals as Africans. It's very interesting, but not unexpected for the time. He said that Africans were so impressed by the uncanny knowledge possessed by the dogs that they just spontaneously confessed to their crimes. But there could be a second reason. And that takes us a little deeper. If the police themselves were convinced by the power of smell, confessions might have been extracted by violence, a technique certainly not unknown to the South African police. A third reason was suggested, and I think the third reason is going to take you back to that, to the method of the identification parade that I outlined for you a little earlier. This third reason was actually suggested contemporaneously and then picked up later by a historian of policing, a man called Keith Scher, and an anthropologist called Hammond Took. And it was picked up also at the same time by the commissioner of police and the dog master, Cornelius Kuiper. And that reason was witchcraft. In 1913, the dog master said, the moral effect has been very great, especially upon Africans who call our dogs the witch dogs. And I want you to understand how alive witchcraft was at the time. Witchcraft is an imperfect word for the cosmology, but it's the closest we can get perhaps in English. By the 1920s, it was a pandemic. Remember, this was a time after the World War of social dislocation, of political conquest, land dispossession of the African majority, and a time of terrifying diseases. Influenza and rinderpest stalked the land. It was a time of fear and terror, and witchcraft erupted. Also, these cosmologies, these indigenous healing practices, were badly misunderstood and totally outlawed. You were not allowed to kill a witch or a wizard. The colonial authorities outlawed it, and the state followed up on that. The authorities ruthlessly attacked what is popularly known as the witch doctors, but it's not really the correct term. It's better to say the Isangoma or the Nyangas. And they were the ones who traditionally had looked for witches and wizards in the community. But the witchcraft suppression laws of 1910 and later in 1957 outlawed them, made them illegal, and forced them to go underground. And these laws drove a wedge between Black and white communities. Africans arguing that the state had actually aligned itself with the witches. And here's how it worked. These Isangomas would be the ones to sniff out a witch. And this is the process of smelling out. If you know there's a witch in the village, you get your Isangoma, they lock themselves in a hut, then they burst out of the hut and in a frenzy, making noise. And all the people of the homestead are arranged in a line. And the chanting in a low voice, he asked the spirits to help him to touch the wizard or the witch. And the Isangoma would become excited and frenzied and start sniffing and smelling excitedly until they would find out by smell alone who the wizard or the witch was. Then they would touch the guilty one. And that was the wizard or the witch. And this, of course, there are clear parallels between this process and the smelling out process in the dog identification parade. So when people spontaneously confess, they might have been confessing to evil within themselves rather than to any actual crime that they had committed. And prior to this, colonial crime had been profoundly visual. You looked for clues. It had been auditory and oral. You interrogated witnesses. You asked what they'd seen and heard. But now, there was a new agent of detection. And forensic science, this olfactory science, the science of smell, met at the confluence of a far older understanding of evil itself. Evil was unseen, evil was unheard, evil could only be smelled. Well, the police were happy, they solved a lot of cases, but don't forget that the confessions might have been extracted by a different understanding of being smelled out. But all that said, one thing that gives me confidence in the accuracy of many of the police reports is that the constables were not afraid to talk about failure. I don't think there was a large-scale cover-up or orchestrated conspiracy. In fact, several grumpy constables noted in different cases, widely separated by geography, just how bad a dog called Milan was at his job. Couldn't track, failed to do it, while at the same time separated by hundreds of miles and not able to look at each other's reports. These constables praised the abilities of dogs like Trevin or Bosco, who bounced back from motherhood and became a major tracker. And in particular, they were impressed by a dog that I mentioned before called Sawa. Sawa became a legend. He was a little stunted, runty Doberman, and he died at the age of 9 years, and he's the only dog buried at a police station by the special permission of Commissioner of Police. And he was born and bred at the Irene Police Depot. He was not a promising puppy. He was nervous and awkward, but he thrived on the training, and he was only able to work with his own handler. He trusted him. And this brings me to Sawa versus the Ninevites. And first, a little background. The Ninevites, I don't know if any of you know about the Ninevites, but they're this legendary gang. They're the precursor to the crazy mad gangs that we have in South Africa, particularly here in the Western Cape. They were the first, they're the ancestors, they're the ones, the lineage behind these gangs that we have today. We're very dangerous men. But these gangs were on the reef up in Joburg, and they preyed. Sometimes they've been described as early colonial resistance fighters, depends which historian you talk to, but they were certainly feared by the mine workers and the people who worked on the mines. And the police were having no luck tracking these guys down because no one would testify against them. People were too afraid until they brought in the dogs, because the dogs didn't know enough to be afraid. So they tracked down the Ninevites. And it was this that broke the back of the Ninevite outrages. And in fact, in one telling incident, when finally they'd managed to arrest one of these gangsters, they were standing in the courtroom, and in a speech from the dock, this gangster said, he was called upon to plead, and he said to the judge, my lord, what can we do now? The white man has trained his dogs to become witches, and they have smelt us out. And I think that really captures what was going on here. Sawa, I have to tell you a little bit about Sawa. We mustn't become distracted, but Sawa was a legend. Once famously followed a spur that was 132 hours old. When he was an old dog, a year before he died, he tracked a suspect 100 miles in the Karoo. It's in the Guinness Book of Records. No dog has ever surpassed it. He also once caught a fellow canine suspect in the only case of stock theft by an animal I've ever seen in the archives. Somebody was stealing ducklings in Pretoria, and he managed to track down a dog and pointed it out to the embarrassment of the owner of the dog, who quickly offered to pay for all the ducklings that had been stolen, even the duckling that was still alive, just very, very bedraggled. But of course, not all dogs were Sawas, but there was a remarkable rate of successful tracking. But here again, I would urge us to be cautious, because one of the reasons could be false alerts. And I think most of you know about false alerts. There's a lot of good research into it now, particularly into police dog false alerting. And what goes on here is that the ancient canine ability of sniffing is augmented by another evolutionary trait, And that's the desire to please a human handler and to closely watch our body language. The dogs might have been watching their humans closely. And because they rely evolutionarily now, in the last 10,000 years, they've come to rely pretty closely on people. They can read human body language very, very well. So some of the police's tracker dogs might have been using not their noses, but their eyes, watching their handlers for clues rather than tracking the crime scene. But here's the thing. This is the really interesting part. This phenomenon was completely understood at the time by the police themselves. They had a series of commissions into this right from the start of the using dogs for olfactory detection, for using them for their sense of smell and tracking. They were really, really worried about this. And they understood the clever Hans effect very, very well. Now, the clever Hans effect is named after the eponymous horse called Hans, who rocketed to worldwide fame in 1907 by stamping out the answers to simple arithmetic problems. And of course, Hans couldn't actually do arithmetic, but Hans was clever. He would watch the audience, and if the audience looked like, oh, it's about to be answered, he'd quickly stamp his foot, and the audience would be, oh, brilliant, brilliant, Hans, you've nailed it, you know how to add 5 plus 8. But Hans was clever at reading the human body language. So we know that we call it the observer expectancy effect, but the police knew it at the time and they were very, very worried about it. And they always used 2 dogs, and they never allowed the dog handler to be told in advance who any suspects were. And the constable who was in charge of the case was not allowed to go with the dog handler and the dogs. They had to do their tracking alone without the constable to make sure that there wasn't this observer expectancy effect. So there was this, that's incredible that they were expecting that at the time. Certainly was counterintuitive to what I'd been expecting to find in the archive. And then the other thing I can't emphasize enough is that the judges, the South African judges, were absolutely clear that the dogs could never, ever be allowed to hurt anyone. They were not allowed to touch anyone. In fact, in a number of court cases, including Rex versus Jan Mentor, who was delightfully a cheese thief, he stole cheese habitually. He was scratched and bitten by a police dog, and the court found immediately in favor of Jan Mentor, and the Minister of Justice had to pay him an astonishingly high sum of £25. Because the police dogs were the pride of the nation. They were, when the royal family came and visited South Africa, we've got quite a lot of colonial cringe. Everyone was terribly excited about the colonial visit in 1947. They were firstly showed the police dogs, but actually the police dog training unit was at the cutting edge of olfactory detection and tracking globally. Dogs were sent out in the 1940s and 50s to Pakistan, Palestine, America, Europe, Kenya, Southern Rhodesia, and policemen came from all over the world to train with the dogs so that they would go with a dog that they had bought and then use that dog abroad when they moved back. South African police dogs were really, in terms of olfactory detection, among the best in the world. But then everything changed. Everything changed, and it changed in a year I can measure. Sometimes change is quick. Normally it's slow, and we historians struggle to measure it. Here we can measure it exactly. Everything changed in 1961. So 50 years after the start of the police dog program. And this was because of a change in policing itself under the increasingly heavy hand of the apartheid state. You'll remember this highly racist, highly segregationist state. And in the early 60s, it was becoming increasingly a case of the struggle against apartheid heating up. It was also a time when the South African state had been condemned by the United Nations. It was a time when there was something called the Sharpeville Massacre, where 69 ordinary citizens who were just protesting outside a police station, were gunned down by South African policemen who themselves were, I don't know, a mixture of violent terror, anger. They gunned these protesters down, they shot them and wounded so many more. So the South African police were looking for a new style of policing, and they sent two policemen, Lieutenant Colonel Brink and Warrant Officer Killian. They sent them to Europe and England for a little study tour. And they wanted to shift the focus to canine usage away from the mines and the countryside and the rural areas. They wanted to take this kind of policing to the cities. And they wanted to take it away from just tracking and using the nose. They wanted a different kind of dog, a different kind of dog handler for a very different purpose. Oh, he was the royal, this couldn't have been more different, because the different purpose was this. They wanted patrol dogs, defense dogs, attack dogs. And they wanted them to control ordinary citizens, not just criminals. From 1962, these new dogs were imported. They were mainly German Shepherds. And they were attached to the flying squads in the urban centers, Joburg, Cape Town, Durban. For the first time, there was this new technology. In essence, they were a force multiplier with the emphasis on force. They were at first focused, it's quite interesting what the police said they were going to use them for, this force multiplier that self-evidently was being used to change the very nature of policing in the country. What they said they were going to use them for, this lined up row of German Shepherds. I mean, here they are, even in the souvenir brochure, they feature. But what they wanted to use them for was this. They wanted to use them for gangsters and kind of social delinquents. These guys here, the white guys, were the ducktails. I guess you would, in the American context, they would be called the greasers. They were these guys who were very against authority. They wore their hair slicked back with brill cream, and they were very antisocial. They were always spray painting things and having fights. And they and their Sheilas, they called their women their Sheilas, would drive around town on motorbikes and just raise hell. And then the other people they claimed they were bringing the dogs for were the Tutsis, the gangsters, these kind of slick, cool, very Americanized African gangsters. They're very big in Sophiatown and other places in the informal settlements. But they were also anarchic, against authority. They had quite a cult following in the informal settlement, or the townships, as they were called at the time. And the police said they were going to use them for crowd control and these anti-social forces. But it very, very quickly segued into this kind of crowd control, into controlling ordinary people who were protesting the illegitimate apartheid state. And let me tell you, a year after they decided to bring in the German Shepherds, there were only 164 tracker dogs of the old school Doberman mixed breed. There were already 230 patrol attack dogs. And over the next few years, tracker dogs were used in 3,000 cases. The patrol dogs were used in 13,000 cases, bringing down 5,000 suspects with their teeth. It was a new kind of policing, and it needed a new kind of handler, a new kind of training. And that meant creating a new kind of dog. And these were the hounds of apartheid. This was the dog. These were the dogs used against citizenry, for ordinary people, for crowd control, for suppressing opposition. They were also used in the military. From 1964, the military and the police forged this very close relationship with dogs. They were very excited about using dogs and getting dogs from the police and using them in similar ways in the illegal border war, for example, and in military deployment. They even brought in, they didn't think they were German Shepherd enough. They brought in actually Siberian tundra blood. They used this, a wolf, a full-on, full-blood wolf called Big Red, that they thought would make it an even purer, better killing machine. And what we are left with is this archive of brutality. I remember very, very clearly as a child, and this was true of most white schools, because I grew up, in this era, And what they would do every year, the police would come to the school with the dog, and it would be white cops, white policemen, who would send an African man, of course, in a protective suit, of course, running away. And he worked for the police, running away. And then they'd release the police dog, and the police dog would bring that guy down. And it was a part of reminding white school kids of the power of the state. And it was part of lectures they would give about fearing African communism, and fearing the influence of Russia, and fearing the African National Congress, and fearing the liberation struggle. They would then come in at the end with these dogs saying, but don't worry, we got this. And that's what it very iconically would represent. So with this, in this archive of brutality, we've got scores of cases that I've found of police dogs attacking, savaging, mutilating, being used as weapons of interrogation and even torture. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission reports are full of it too. And this is where the stereotype, Jacob Zuma's stereotype, was born. That is the South African police dog that has taken over in our minds and blotted out any other story. And what I think this means for us, and here I'll conclude, as historians of the human-animal past, is what is clear is that the larger meta-narratives, you know, the big stories of oppressive policing and the role of the state, has overshadowed the smaller stories of the intimate relationship between humans and dogs, and the visceral reality of what could be accomplished when humans and dogs work together. We started this talk with the vicious running dogs of the apartheid state, but we have forgotten, and now we must remember, the 50 years between 1911 and 1961, in which dogs were not used for teeth and claws, but only for their noses. The shadow of what came afterwards, the looming telos of the apartheid, the iron fist of the apartheid state with a snarling German shepherd on a flimsy leash, obscures the achievements of the men and dogs of Kwaggaspoort a generation before. And that blunt telos, that overarching meta-narrative, the big story, obscures the contemporaneous doubt, you know, the doubt they felt at the time, the anxiety, the friability, the experimentation, the self-reflexivity that they surprisingly felt. And of course their work, I pointed out to you how it was fissured through with problems, a lot of contemporaneous societal political problems. But there was successes, and there is a curious, dare we say it, beauty in what they were able to accomplish. And if we only remember the stereotype, that's just bad history. Because what is lost is the dogmaster Kuiper's heart beating faster when he thought of a good dog's nose. What is lost is how Sauer tracked a stock thief 100 miles in the Karoo Desert and found that missing stock and brought it home. What is lost is the restraint, surprising restraint, that South African judges and the police imposed on themselves. What is lost is how they muzzled those dogs. What is lost is understanding the intimate triad of dog keeper and his two dogs in that side cart, in that motorbike, driving around the countryside and making things a little better through an art, an ancient art of two creatures, wolf and man, who have co-evolved together in the last 10,000 years. The understanding they reached. What is lost is how Sauer found the ducks. But then in the shift from nose to teeth, so much was lost. And what we should really take away from this is that apartheid's dogs, those hounds of apartheid, were not inevitable. They were once good dogs, and they can be good dogs again. Thank you.